This draw-on lecture, Keen on Architecture, is about the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. His first name was Ludwig, in Barcelona. It's referred to as the Barcelona Pavilion for a fair in 1929, the International Exposition in Spain. This was the representation for the country of Germany, and Mies van der Rohe was hired because he did such a good job at the Workman exhibition in Stuttgart in 1927. They sent him to build this within 1 year, and in 1930, because it was an exhibition building, it was pulled down. But the remarkable prestige and legacy of it lived on until finally in 1983, the Catalan architects reconstructed the pavilion permanently, and has been a popular tourist destination ever since because it's got this mythical standing in the history of modern architecture in the 20th century. So this being the first of two pieces by Mies van der Rohe, the second will be in Chicago, where he emigrated upon the Nazi oppression in the later part of the 1920s into the 30s and landed at the Armor Institute in Chicago. So what we have here is a very plain sort of exercise. It sort of looks like a residential scale. It really is just an idea of the absolute distinction between structure and enclosure. The building rests on a U-shaped enclosure of travertine and helps in forming a service annex and a big water basin at the base, which we see up front here on the left. So we're going to work with this in terms of sort of an abstract essay, almost if it's a sculpture itself, even though it houses one major sculpture in there, and then the other object is Mies's Barcelona Pavilion chair, which iconically is probably equally as emblematic of 20th century design as the Barcelona Pavilion is. So we're going to look at these planes in space. We'll keep the model up here for a second. Our view shed is going to be from this plane over here looking towards, this way, looking towards the front aspect of it. And so we'll see the generation of all the planes floating in space and passing by each other, much like the style. It's like the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, where you're passing planes and working in a triaxial space. The definition of this is most prominent with the movement of those planes in space. So one of our first things we're going to do is we're going to sort of indicate the different planes that we can see from our photographic point of view here. And so we see the mix of travertine, marble, and onyx as the very extravagant materials, the very, very simple type of form and shape of plan type. So we'll do a sort of a southern exposure coming down here as the sun from the southwest lights up the rim of this. So this white plane floating up here on the top is very important to us. The lit travertine base is important to us here. The pool of water eventually will be important. But we're going to do the basic planes in sort of a generic light tone of wash to articulate the vertical support for these, and then the slender cruciform columns that chrome columns that Wright has, that Mies van der Rohe has to structure the building. So to get to a shadow version of the wall over here to the left, which kind of is at the back end of the property, other side is probably another pavilion from the 1929 Expo. We're simply going to use, because it's actually a white, kind of grayish, we'll use this same type of blue shadow cast of a light, transparent, blue-black wash to cover that plane to start with. And as we do this, because there's a lot of features in the stones and marbles that Mies chose, we don't want to make it sort of a pure type of plane to make it seem monolithic, because there are striations inside the material. So we will move it about once we take the watercolor pond to the paper itself. So we'll work with horizontal strokes because that's how the stone was laid out. And then we'll keep some white areas within those as well for the highlights, and let the ponding accentuate certain strokes as well. And we'll take this right down to the base. So that'll be a white stone that's in shade. that will pick up a reflection in the water later on. Okay, next is to move inside to a red onyx, which will be inside here. And that red onyx actually has a bit of a green hue to it as well. So we're going to move more toward the green right now and move that into the same transparent wash we started with, just adding that green to it. That's going to be a cool green because it's not only in shade, it's actually in the shadows of being in the interior of the space. And we're going to try to leave the edge of this marble wall that comes up to it brighter, and then the walls behind it darker. And this one column up here, which is a chrome column, we'll leave that white too, so it pulls off of that back wall. So this has the interior face of those walls. And again, because they are spectacular in terms of the performance of the grains of the stone, we can use the brush strokes to kind of hint at the irregularity. It's not a pure monochromatic type of tone. So it gives them a feel of kind of the stone moving across that face. Then we'll bring that over to the front edge. Again, we're going to leave those two vertical strokes white for now, because they do represent the edge of the wall support and then obviously the column support itself. So we want the green blue to pass beyond it. And then to leave a little bit of light within that, if we make it too monolithic going back to the interior, it might eliminate some of the movement we want. So we're not going to make it too dark to start here. And it's sort of a small area to wash, so just a fine tip brush is fine for now. Those are the major planes that kind of hold up the interior. There's one more over here in the far right corner here, and it's highly reflective. It's a highly polished type of stone. So we'll give a tone to it that will reflect some of the nature that's adjacent to it. So that also is a deep, rich kind of green blue stone. So we'll come to that edge and drop that right down with our perspective vanishing back here. And then beneath it, there is a support wall, because this whole thing is built on a plinth raised up off the ground. And then the rest of the building is fairly diaphanous, so that we see through to another site here. We see through to the vegetation beyond. So as these set up and dry, we're going to put in that background vegetation. So just using a pencil quickly to kind of outline that. It's only about 2 or 2.5 stories tall. The building is 1 story tall, again on a plinth, and the trees rise up for another 1.5 stories. So they're not going to fill up the back or background, but they are going to kind of go back in perspective because of the same height trees in the backdrop of the exhibition. We'll pull it down before we get to the corner, and then once it passes the corner, we'll continue it, and again it goes down, and it'll frame out our far edge as well. So we're going to come around the corner of the building at this end and pull back that green down to the grade. So we've got a nice dark edge for all the key aspects we're going to have popping out off of that backdrop. So if you build that wash now, it's again going to be a green, and this time it'll be a warmer green since it's natural. The growth of the trees there in the sunlight. So we'll build that up to be a little bit warmer. And again, this will be a placeholder for now, just to give us the indication of our composition. And because it's going to be a dominant wash across there, we'll double check it with our values. And we're going to need a lot of water and a lot of pigment here to move across the page. It's always better to mix too much than too little. And right towards the end, mix a little bit of blue, because this is a more distant green away from the frontal aspect of what we're doing in the foreground. So that kind of nice blue green for the backdrop seems to work. So we'll make sure there's enough water in there to move that across the palette. And now we can start right at that edge where we want that white edge of the front of the pavilion to really pop off. Take that right to the corner, and then probably don't take it all the way to the edge. Let the architecture of the colors kind of dissipate before they find the edge of the paper, because we are trying to create an illusion here of 3 dimensions on 2. And then we continue that as we run it behind the building here. And then around the corner. There's a little bit of the cantilever. So I'll cover that line work up a little bit with darker tones. And now the key for this is we want to show the movement in the foreground to the subject itself, and then through the subject to the background. So right here and there, Mies van der Rohe is still framing the architecture with view now. So there's a breakdown between interiority and exteriority, so that nature itself becomes part of the context of the architecture. So what we're going to do is show a higher bit of a path here as the land moves up away on the adjacent thing, and then a couple of vertical struts for trees coming down supporting the back. So this will be darker lawn rising up to carry the tree foliage above. On this side, the sun's actually breaking through and washing a brighter tone. So over here, we're going to have vegetation at the underside of this carriage. And we're going to eventually put in dark columns where these lines are to eclipse the value of the backdrop. So you'll see those as shaded in the interior, and the sun will light up the lighter green of the backdrop. So what we have mixed now is just the right amount. It'll be ideal to have this brilliance over here. We'll take that darker as we do value down the road. Now also inside, to show the pieces of furniture, there will be some dark aspects down here layered that will show some of the Barcelona chairs and the condition of interiority here inside the space. And that'll help create a base to that interior. So we'll come back to that. But for now, we just want to run this green across to complete sort of our compositional sketch. You don't have to worry about eclipsing these little column lines in here, because they'll be much darker than the backdrop eventually. So that'll again show that it's transparent, and then integrates the exterior with the interior. Take this one down to the floor line. More like that. And same over here. And that's what's critical when you're trying to create an illusion of 3-dimensional space, is always think about your composition to move up to the building or space proper, and then to the inside of it somehow to show some interiority, and then through some type of glazing or opening to take you beyond. And that's how you can get a distance of 50, 100 feet in terms of the depth of the paper's image. So there's kind of our placeholder for now. We'll bring more value on that to get kind of the structure of showing something naturally architectural beyond the building there. Okay, now for the planes of our pool here. In the pool, obviously there's a water line that comes up, and it's a flat plane that runs, and we'll sort of draw in the lip of the water's edge here. It comes around and meets this side. So that's the height of the water running to this point. But what we're really seeing is we're not seeing the water, we're seeing whatever the water reflects. So this distance would come down to this point and then stop right about here and vanish back to the same horizon line. So we're going to simply draw this wall again at a little bit deeper tone. Same is true for this column, which ends up being a lighter tone against the dark, but now it'll be a darker tone against the light. We'll see the top part of this line going back to the vanishing point. So we just sort of replicate the drawing it upside down. This one comes down straight from there. This one's being reflected here. That's being reflected. And again, it's not going to be a perfect replica of that because it's not. Anytime the wind moves, it kind of shapes the water and makes a different aspect there. And then we have the tops of these walls coming back in space so that this will run just about here and go back and in terms of how much you would see, because this now is set back away from here, whereas this is flush on it. We see a little bit less of it. So we'll see the height of the underside there. This will take us right up. And now it comes to the travertine front, which you can walk around the little pool over here. And to make that sort of set down, we can actually show, so it's so close that we can show the thickness of the top lip. So he's sort of just drafting a little thickness to the actual stonework here. Every so often, there's a construction joint where two pieces are together. And so if we tick mark those out every so often, diminishing as they go back, the same piece gets smaller as it goes back in perspective. Then we take it back to the left vanishing point, which is off the page here to the left, because obviously our eye height is about mid-height through the whole space there. You can see the point just off the paper to the right there. So the left is over here, and just by drawing those lines in, it kind of sets it down as a walkway then, and helps lay that plane down on the grade. And it's a white stone, so it's going to be a bright material in our foreground anyway. Just to articulate that kind of helps and sets that down a bit. And then beneath it, then there are the vertical members that are creating the front face of the wall, the plinth itself. And that drops down the middle of those, and we see a little bit of those construction joints. And then finally, running at the base to our right vanishing point shows the height of that wall from the grade out front. Just making sure those all vantage back to either the right point or the left point. We've kind of built that wall now, and now it kind of looks a little bit more like a swimming pool because you've got the depth of the outside of the pool and now the inside. So now I'm going to go back to those original washes, or you may have to remake them or add to them, but that'll be the base for this reflection. So we'll come to the first one we started with, the kind of blue-black. Make sure there's a lot of water in there. And it's going to be a lot of area there, so we're simply going to move to the middle brush to go across a little bit quicker with less definition in the wall head itself. So we'll go to that medium flat. And then we'll take all the darker areas because the reflection will take some of the tone away. And I'll leave the column edges and faces white for now. We'll deal with those later. And instead of doing that type of detail, I'll do this quicker with one clean wash where it's more monolithic. Well, this edge again, leaving the strokes for the value of the columns and the edges of the walls, page white for now. And then finally, all the way over to here, we see a little bit of the corner of these windows reflected. So this wall comes down vertically, the edge is right there. So when we come to the right edge of the pool, we're going to leave that brighter for now. And then darken up between the wall and that space, and this little space. So we've identified then at least the reflective quality of the building. And because we're working with water, it always has that kind of, adds the reflective quality compared to other media, as it kind of reflects that here. Now, if the light is coming from this direction, it'll light this very brightly in front of us here, but then this is in shade on this side, so we can come back to our blue-black. And wash this front wall. Get it nice and wet to draw it really quickly. We simply start from the top edge of the edge face of that stone, take it up front, and drop it down to grade. Now we've located all of the main planes here. As long as we have the side of light wash here in the foreground for this, we can make that a little more liquefied and then take it at the, because the white of the skin of the building that we see on the outside that's brilliantly lit by the sun is still the same white underneath, but it's in shade. So you want to differentiate that with again, a black blue tone, which will then make that more of an interior for us. And then take that back because these columns will be darker than that ceiling. Then we use that same wash because this will end up being darker when we add value to it, but we'll use that wash up here because this edge of the roof line faces away from the sun, so that's got a different value. But then leave it white next to the darker trees in the backdrop. So against the sky, it's a little bit darker. Against the darker background, it goes a little bit lighter. Okay, so there's the basis of it. It's a very sort of great, this distinction between structure and enclosure is really important. He wanted the building to have an ideal zone of tranquility because he saw the whole fair as being kind of frenzy of showing off the powers of different countries. I think there are maybe 20, 25 countries that are invited to the Universal Exposition in 1929. And so he thought this was a way to have people rest and just experience the space. And so the space gets activated as you walk through it, as you see the dynamism of the planes gently passing by each other. So the building itself became the exhibit. Whereas a lot of times at fairs, you have an iconic building that looks like Japan or looks like Italian, and it's got language that emulates the history of that country. In this case, they were really kind of shooting for a continuous space, blurring the inside and out so that, in fact, it was kind of participatory. And that's the remarkable memory that got it rebuilt in the 1980s by the Catalan architects. Okay, so that's our setup. And now, just like any other sketch, you go back in and kind of drill down, and you pull out the highlights, because now we're probably at 30 or maybe 40% of value. We have to go 40 now to 90% to kind of complete the depth and language of everything. So what's the first thing we're going to do is look for areas that are in direct shadows. That's the strongest part. And so if we look at the aspect here, what's cut here on this line as this wall, if the sun is just behind this wall, it's going to come down and throw a nice sharp line in perspective. So it's going to come off of this wall here and vanish left point. So all the aspect back in here is being thrown into shadow, particularly this lower plane. And that'll take us all the way over to the base of a little part of the walkway at the lower level here is also darker than the plane up above, as this turns and retreats this way. So that becomes a dark. Our edges here where they meet that area will be darker. This plane up here at this corner project to us to make that white stronger will become darker. And then back here, because we're so deep in the house, that interior white becomes darkest right back here because this green back here is actually going to be a light source. That's going to be brighter than our whole interior back there. So it'll keep our eye going from bright to gray to darkest to lighter in the back, right through the home proper. Probably edge this stone wall up front here. So we're going to start to move that through. It's smaller spaces, so we'll mix our, again, blue black and make it a little more pigment based, a little heavier with the value here. You can probably do a little bit of the green in there just to make it in harmony with the rest of the colors, which makes watercolor great media because you don't get in other medias that are of color pencils, color design markers. It's very monolithic and hard to blend them together, which makes it less realistic straight from the media. Whereas this, you can kind of use your skills and the skills of the water to kind of make something more naturalistic, and where the sky then, the blues of the sky then blends all the colors together. So we'll start with check here on what that value is like. That's a nice kind of blue black. And we'll take it in down here lower levels. All the way out to the back floor here. And now that gets cast all the way into the depths of the floor towards the interior. And that's an important dart that cuts in that way. We'll have the edge of this wall be darkest against its reflection there, and then kind of fade out and meander to something a little bit more transparent. So put the pigment in and just bring water into it to kind of move that back to the tone you did have. So you want to push the value of where the pigment is into the corners to trap lights and darks. And we're going to do the same with this plane, which comes down from this wall. We want it to be darkest right at the top here because that's where it's going to be dark in the interior. That'll come right up to the sunlit stone walkway. So we'll do the same on the inside now. Is this plane is darker because it's facing away from the sun. This plane in the back is actually lit up because it's perpendicular to the sun, even though it's not getting direct sunlight. The sun's bouncing off the floor, and it's going to light that back because it's 90 degrees away from that sun inclination, whereas this is parallel to it, so it's facing away from it. So this remains our darker tone here. Same is true for this one. This is also parallel to it, so we make it darkest at the top. So we'll start with the whole plane the same tone and come back with darker tone to gradate it from top down. And then we're going to have it come back on the side of this cruciform column here. The chrome column, we'll put in a little bit with cast shadow. And we'll run it back and let it be lighter. Then we'll use the vegetation behind it and the cash and the darkness of the furniture that runs behind it as a dark to edge that corner. So it'll move that plane back in space. And then we come to a point where the line of the actual structure up above, when the sun hits here, this casts a line that came down to this point and then back. Now this plane is going to come down on the floor plane right here, vanishing back to the left point, and create a great shadow across the whole front here, which is parallel to the edge of the pool. So all the architecture of the plane out front here, this is going to run back towards us as a support wall, but here's the finishing of the initial plinth has got a really strong dark tone, which is going to hold a nice base for us. So we'll start it out once and we'll come back with more value, but this whole lower area is in shade from the roof line. It comes all the way across and on the front plane of the wall behind it. So again, we're trapping the highlights of white of this brilliant walkway plane up here being blasted by the sun, that edge being the sun, which keep bringing values darker and darker and darker around those planes of space. Okay, so now we're sort of up to probably the 50% aspect of it. So we'll go back into those pools and just deepen the value for them. So that's why the architecture of the stone dries out now and gives us that kind of reference of modulation of growth over millennium to build out the travertines and the onyxes. We'll go to the greens now and kind of build that language out. So in our green pool, we'll add more blue, a bit of the black too, deepen it. If it's too warm of a green, again, just go to a red really quick and that kind of browns it up, kind of red orange. There you go. And we'll test that out. A little bit muted because it's in the background for us, but we'll do a wash over what we started. So that's most important. One of our darkest areas is right through the building at the base here and right over the top of the roof line. So we're going to highlight that, give some shape to the undercarriage of the trees. They're not subjects, they're just a backdrop, a tone for us. So don't worry about detailing out the leaves or things just yet. Turn it up over here. The sun will strike the top of it or the left side of it, so you'll have shade sides, the top, and the more brilliant aspects. Bring that over to this side, and then right when it edges out, it'll become much darker by the time we're finished over here, adding more value to it. And that'll hold that corner better, and then we'll take that same tone right through the plane, and between the column, we'll kind of vary it and how it moves across. We'll leave some trunk line openings for tree support up to the canopy. There you go. And then a little bit of a wash this way. We'll come back and keep making this edge darker and let it kind of go to white because it's going to then have a darker tone of the edge here eventually. And for now, and then take that over on this side as well, because this is going to be a brighter green. So this will eventually be darker next to it and darker at the base. So we're going to leave that light as it is, and then make above, which is facing away from the sun now, darker on these edges. And then I'll clip some of the line work over here too as well. And then take that right down to the base here. And then back in the pool, we want to take these two darks deeper into the pool itself and reflection. So again, with water, you're not drawing the water itself, you're drawing how the water works. I'm going to pull a little bit of the green down into the pool area. And then eventually it'll be the sky up above behind it. So it's the edge of that. And now we'll come back into the underside here because we want to make sure that it's deepest right where it meets the white and becomes neutralized again, and the back edge where it meets the backdrop. Here we'll make the green darker to make that brighter. Here we're going to make the inside roof darker to make the green lighter. We'll take our same plane of value of shadow tone, and we're going to run that along this front edge to strengthen that up. It's the highest contrast we see. Really important here at the corner. And then just use water to run it back. Blend it out so it's a nice movement of the tone across that interior skin. Now on this end, we're going to work the other way. We're going to start at the base with a deeper tone and make darkest right here. And then wash that up to the top. And we'll come back and keep hitting this wall, because then the darker we make this, the brighter it seems like the light's shining on that green in the backdrop. And then we can come to something which is so far back, it's just really a form that's in the space. And we assume it's a series of the Barcelona chairs back there. So we'll add a little bit more of the black to the blue black and start to build up this zone of furnishings inside the space here. We'll give them a little bit of a white between that and the backdrop. And then float them off the floor as well. Just so it seems like there's some aspect of objects inside the space, which is very sort of minimalistic, but nonetheless, they were there. Okay, now they have that blue-black for that interiority there. We'll add a little bit of blue to that because we need to do our next 70% wash of highlights here. So we're going to come back to all the corners we want and make them more pronounced with their edges. So for instance, we know that at the top here, it receives the least amount of light against its white edge. So we want to make that stronger. And then coming to the water, just trail that back down so the tone stays up top. And then it hits the plane and runs up here, because even though it's a lighter plane there, it still is darker towards the top of that plane, and then bring the water down. Accentuate the movement of the light coming into the space and bouncing back up and having its strongest impact lower on the wall and the least amount above it. We'll do that for all the corners here. So now we have to move the way light isn't quite so linear. It's bouncing around and highlighting corners. And that's how we see 3 dimensions on 2-dimensional paper, is by our highlights of lights and darks. And just by, sometimes you can wash it out and make it more monolithic, because then you can leave the difference there and you kind of get more of the texture of the material then for the walls that are actually in the space. You do the same for probably the top here, because the travertine wall that's vertical on the outside of the pool here will actually read darkest right at the top where it's brightest next to it. We're going to add some value there. And then drop it down with some water a little bit so it's a bit more monolithic. There you go. And now we'll do, as we push towards 80 here, we want to come back into some of our line work, as we've got these columns that come down in the front of the space will appear much darker now with the backdrop being lighter. And so they're going to come up into space at sort of this height, all vanishing off of that point. And in the backdrop, we're going to have, I guess, a third one here. A little bit skinnier in the backdrop for these, which we see. It's now less water and more of the pigment in the blue-black. And you can sort of dab out the water of your brush so that bristles are actually a little bit drier. and you just barely tap the pigment, and that way it works more like a pen then. And so you can take that dark now, that support, and run it on top of the tree line so it stains away from it. That'll give us a sense of the structure where he floats between columns of support sometimes and the wall support sometimes. Okay, now we're pushing towards the 80% of value. So we're going to go deeper with the blue and the black, mix in some of the green just to uniform the space. And so in a sense, we're going to go over the entire drawing again like we have in other media, but spend less time actually doing the value as we step up to the most prominent value in the whole drawing. So we'll look to those key aspects, those key parts that deepen the most. And so right at the rim, when the water meets the architecture, there's always sort of a dark moving pattern of deep reflection as this stone projects out over the edge of the water. So it kind of flies over that. Come back in and deepen that area up. And that separates the skin of the water from the architecture it's supporting. You know, it kind of floats a little bit. We could probably come back in this corner over here and anchor that deep green reflection behind the wall. And then take it into the base here. Where we have land actually come down to the terrain of the pavilion. So our deepest green, blue, black is right at the base over here. Maybe a little lip. There's a distance that runs through the space. And we'll carry it through to the upper side to show the closest part of the architecture of the trees that hovers over the backside of the pavilion. Show a little bit of depth under that canopy in the back. If these trees rise up and have sort of their head shroud to it, they'll actually have the depth of more things going on in the bit of a little forested area on the site back there. So informationally, it's a secondary content, but it's nice to see through to something that has a little bit of a subject. So now it seems like there's a terrace, takes you to higher land, takes you deeper and back into that space. Not so much on this end. It's got maybe a little change of value as it steps away from us. So maybe the lower ends are a little bit darker before it gets to the lighter trees in the backdrop. And then maybe it finally hits the underside of these. So this is just as you see fit here. And now we're about to the last couple of minutes of just our final 90% dark and see where we want to really attract the eye to, because that's the edge condition to us. So in the foreground here, which would really support the edge of the pools, we could take strength of this edge here being dark and run it right by, even darker by the stone walk. And then the light that comes down these walls or the cruciform columns are in front of it, they're not at the edge of the wall, so they're actually going to be under shade as the light comes down for a little bit above it. So that'll turn the corner and be in shade, and that'll be in shade. Read north. And now we'll go to our corners one more time that are most important to us, is that keeps the architecture flowing in space. We'll come to this edge here. We'll start with the darkest element and just wash it back. And if you've got too much water on your brush, just dab out that on a piece of paper, and then we'll coax that back. A nice turn to that corner. And this is where you have to think through how the drawing works and not necessarily how the material works, because you know it's all the same material, and yet we're painting it out dark at one end of it and light at the other. So this one is completely surrounded by light, so we can keep that monolithic, but the underside might grade back and say the inside of this plane floating behind our wall, because it's a horizontal plane facing the earth, receives less light than the one that's facing us directly. So that plane can go darker right in the front here, and then wash it off to the side. I'll hold that one down. And then we could put in a tone for the sky, but it seems like just with the planes of the architecture and the language of the nature behind it, that's enough. The blue up top might be distracting. I thought maybe it'd be nice to have that reflected in this little bit of blue down here, but I think it's working well enough now as the range of tones there. One thing we could do to set the walkway down up here is take some of the blue black and a real light wash and just come to the edge here and differentiate it from the water itself. So it can start like that to hold that edge, and then just use the water to kind of let it go back to page white. So again, it's the same material, it's the same color in our knowledge base, but we're going to do it darker on this edge of it and lighter as it comes towards us. So if it's too crisp, if it seems like the pool's empty and it's not actually a water flow, then we come back on the top, we can show some movement of the wind in the air, which will help that plane. If we do that, maybe with a little bit more of a blue in there. There you go. And then just work kind of in the direction of a vanishing point over here on the left, and kind of dribble some lines kind of moving along that plane that are horizontal. Remember, they're going to diminish and keep coming back this way, back to that point. And that way you might get a little bit more of a sense of it being an active feature here, and not just the planes going into the earth, but it's actually a horizontal plane in that top skin. And that might have a little trace of some black marks in there, kind of ticking away. Just to kind of trick the eye into thinking that's a reflective material like water. Kind of simple to try to tempt water. Sometimes it's difficult to pull it off completely, but that sometimes is a nice technique to make it seem like it's active. And we'll take that all the way down to remind you that once the wind blows in a direction, it's going to vanish all the horizontal lines of the wind down the water to the same vanishing point. And then obviously we'll cut right through the movement of the sky up above it too. So that'll help settle that down. So inside that space, the most memorable art object there is the Barcelona chair, which is still on the market by a couple of different manufacturers to this day. It has its two stitched pads for more comfort. They come in a variety of colors once you order them. Found in a lot of office waiting rooms and